Welcome back to the Real Estate Rat Pack Radio Show with Chris, Joe, and Rob. The crew is taking your calls, so dial in at 1-800-808-5548.
And we're back. There you go, Joe. Joe's finally back. No, but we were having a good conversation between the break that was actually one of our exiting cues we were talking about, which is, appraisal issues going on right now. And one of the things that we're going to see, and we're going to continue to see this, is we saw it when the market all of a sudden went into this hyper market, and now we're seeing it a little bit right now as the market's slowing down. But, we were talking about, Christi was making a comment about, an appraisal, for example, that might be done 2 months ago at one appraised value, and then it was done and that deal busted out, et cetera. And then it comes back around 2 months later. Nothing has changed in regards to the relative market, but then the appraisal is made for $12,000, $15,000 less 2 months later. And so, one of the things appraisals, you have to understand about appraisals to all of our consumers out there is, unfortunately, it's still a human-based appraisal. It's still an opinion of value based upon that individual who was doing that. Now, we try to have comps out there. We try to make sure that individuals understand that, a general rules for an appraiser, and this has gone over, has to be something that is comparable, that is within a 6-month period, that has like qualities in regards to bedrooms, size of homes, pool if it has a pool, square footage on the lot, et cetera, right? But all things being considered, there's other things out there as reference to quality of home. How do they rate that quality? What do they view on the roofing? What do they view on the improvements inside the home? And so, unfortunately, those quality differences are an opinion of value associated with the appraiser. And those can change, unfortunately. I mean, I see it all the time. I get somebody who calls me up and says, can you help me with this file? Oh, and by the way, we have an appraisal on it already. And my typical thing is guess what? I can't use your appraiser, or your appraisal. I have to order my new one, and then all of a sudden I get my new one in, and my new one's less.
Yeah,
and those phone calls are not fun.
One of my favorite questions I asked in class is, what could go wrong?
What could go wrong?
What happens is that you had somebody who had a high appraisal, thought they were going to get another high appraisal, you got a new appraisal, they let the buyer move into the house.
Right.
What could go wrong, right?
Exactly.
Well, one of the things, HVCC, which is the House Value Code of Conduct.
Code of Conduct, that is correct.
The thing is that, of course, like all legislation, had good intentions in the beginning. We all know the road to perdition is paved with what good intentions. So the issue is appraisers now can no longer know the lender firsthand. The lender can't call his go-to guy that knows the area, knows this neighborhood. I'm a suburban realtor. We have certain neighborhoods that could be right next door to each other, but values are completely different.
Correct.
So if they're calling these management companies that now have to manage the appraisals and the lender has to go through it, so kind of like a blind approach to hiring an appraiser, you might have a Lake Houston, Lake Conroe, Galveston, San Antonio appraiser coming into Katy who does not know the distinction, and it's very fine, the distinction between the two, and he may not use the appropriate properties. Our problem as realtors is, yes, we want to educate them, and we do. We make appraisal packets. We meet the appraiser out there. We explain why we think the comps are there and why the value is there. But once that decision is made, it's very hard to have it unmade.
Right.
So then you have a buyer who now may have to bring extra money to the table he did not anticipate. You have a seller who has a price offered by a ready, willing, and able buyer who's now told that that's not the market value of his home. It's lower, so he's got equity that he had hoped for and had a buyer willing to give him, and now may have to accept less equity.
Right.
It's very difficult in our market, especially coming to a spring market.
Oh, yes.
When they're going back 6 months on the softer numbers. They're not anticipating the market where we are, and we know where the market's going or hope where the market's going. So it's difficult.
How often do you see? I experienced this myself with my house. I refinanced at, I don't know how many years ago now, but anyway, I had a guy that came out, an appraiser, and he was in and out 30 minutes.
Right.
And I got an appraisal back from him that was significantly lower than I'm not an appraiser, so I know that I can be, very off from what I expected, but it was massively off from what I expected. So I'm like, I don't think this guy did his job.
And
I hired somebody else. I paid again.
Right.
The guy came out and spent 3 hours and came back with an appraisal that was about
But you hadn't
15% different.
But you hadn't removed that school bus that was in the back of your backyard yet.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
I like what
Indy-
Chris said though about it being an opinion of values, because I've been in this battle over the 30 years that it's always been a battle in many ways in many markets. But I've actually watched three on one property. The individuals get three different appraisals and come out $75,000 apart. They were all senior appraisers, and so what you said, Chris, it is an opinion of value on their part. You know, did they get up that morning and had a fight with their wife on the way out or whatever? But and so I always try to communicate that both to buyers and sellers that regarding that. I also try to help them realize that their job is to look backwards. Okay, and not necessarily as much forward.
Right.
And so I try to this is the difference between us and them. We're looking forward. We're looking at where we are today, where we're going. We're looking at supply and demand. And it recently just happened to one of our clients that his appraisal came in low. But then he sent me the appraisal to look at, but he didn't comment on the supply. That there was a shortage in that area. He didn't comment on that area actually economically was being affected with a new office building right there along the Beltway where the Phillips building's going in, and this time next year, hopefully oil prices don't change too much, that there will be 3,000 people moving into that area, and which is affecting why there's a low supply.
Right.
So I think those are the challenges that many times we have to go back on those. Point them out, but then what you said, Christi, it is an uphill battle trying to get them.
And a constant battle.
Trying to get them to go back and say, look.
And your PAC actually is always watching the appraisal.
Yes.
We actually had, when HVCC first came out, we actually met with all of our legislators, let them know exactly where we stand on this, and we did get some reform on that legislation.
Right.
Is it perfect? No, but
This is my ignorance on the real estate side of appraisals. Can you, as a seller, obtain more than one appraisal?
it's not the seller, though. You understand? It's the buyer's lender.
It's the lender side.
And it really depends.
In my case.
If it's VA, it sticks with the property.
Yeah.
If it's FHA and it's discernible by another FHA.
Right. So the way it
really
generally
depends.
works is your government loans, your FHA, your USDA, your VA loans. So VA has their own system. And then FHA and USDA, you order through your traditionally speaking, your standard ways of doing it. However, in your government loans, they stick with the property for a 6-month period. So what happens is if you have an appraisal on a VA, for example, and it comes in bad, and you've fought it whatever it needs to be, and it still has not been adjusted, what ends up happening is that appraisal will stick with that home for a 6-month period.
And it's just harmful to the consumer. Please know that your PAC is doing the best we can. But again, go to voicefortexas.com. As a consumer, this allows you to be a part of our voice.
It'll be a lot bigger voice then.
Absolutely.
It should be like
absolutely.
a credit score. They should take the mid score.
Right.
Yeah, I wish.
Yeah, no, and what happened, most of the thing people don't realize this is, we had HVCC, which is a Home Value Code of Conduct, and then that changed, obviously, with the new legislation that came out with Dodd-Frank, and so it's actually been named a different aspect, but the same thing, though, associated with the Code of Conduct from an appraisal perspective, the appraisal requirements. And one of the things is not everybody uses technically an AMC. An AMC, basically, it's an appraisal management company. A lot of your big banks are using the AMCs. What the intent of this whole thing was to do is to try to take away the bias of an appraiser getting somebody in their ear from a lender perspective and saying, but if you could really make value at this, and so what they're trying to do is make sure that it's truly a comparable value. No, it's still not a perfect science, and it's still not one of those things that is perfect out there. However, one of the things you always need to be working with your lender is how do you go about contesting if an appraisal comes back bad? Because the onus a lot of times on the lender to be able to go back and be able to prove or provide information back and say, hey, can you relook at this based on this data? Because I'll tell you, a lot of times on your government side, especially a VA, remember a lot of times the way the VA system works, for example, they will assign somebody that might be completely out of the area. So they might, and I've seen this before, they come in to do an appraisal, and they unfortunately get comps in some communities that aren't correct. And then sometimes you have other AMCs that will have, just because they have somebody on the list, an AMC will order somebody out in the area. So you also want to verify, and this is something I tell everybody important, that the lender you're working with uses a certain set, or how do they work on their appraisal side? Do they use through an AMC, or do they self-manage it? And how many appraisal companies do they use, or do they limit that because that way they can exert greater quality associated
and
with that.
appraisers are held to the same standards we are, which is
Absolutely.
competency, and through the TALCB they are required to be competent. Of course, when I teach classes, I talk about this a lot. Are you competent if you're coming from Conroe and appraising a house in Katy?
Absolutely.
And my answer would be absolutely not.
Yep. No, and and it's one of those things is there's a lot of good appraisers out there. There's a lot of really good ones, and there's a lot of really bad ones, by the way. And I think that goes without being said in anything, right? In every industry. So there's some that I sit there and have complete confidence on. Other ones sit there and go, oh my
they're
gosh,
also making,
them
if
again.
they're with an AMC, they're also making half as much as they used to.
That is correct.
Now the
Well, no,
AMC
they're charging
takes
it because a lot of times what you're having to do, charge them more because the AMC has their fee they put on top of it. And I can tell the horror stories that I've had to use whenever I've had to work through an AMC, and those aren't probably something I should say on air. So we are getting the indication that we have to go to break again, and we have one last segment coming up.
Man.
Exactly.
This
so
break
stay
brought
tuned.
to you by the word salient.
That is
Salient.
correct. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.